Okay. I think we're up and running. My apologies for the technical difficulties and the delays that they caused. At least hopefully everybody can see. I will make a copy of this available on YouTube with both the recording as well as the texts of all the slides for those that would like to have their own hard copy. But hopefully this way we can share information while we're going through it and get through that. I'm just looking around and I'm seeing that Michelle has not popped back in yet. And I know she was putting up a sign to let people know we were in here rather than the library. She's coming. How do you know she's coming? Oh, you can see her. Oh, okay. So we'll give her a couple minutes to join us. And she just went past. Maybe while we're waiting for her, do we have any questions about the first two segments that we have already done, about the basics of Jewish belief in the tiniest list, and then the description of the chain of Torah? Do we have any questions that people need answered now? Okay. One other thing I want to point out, that as Michelle is back, that Michelle is going to be helping with a little bit of translation. So if you would like to sit closer to her, giving a little bit of Spanish help for those people that don't find my English so perfect.
It's perfect, Rabbi.
Oh, trust me, it's not perfect. I taught English for 3 years and I needed to teach myself a little bit more before I finished, but haven't quite got there. All right, so this is going to the conclusion of our introduction section to the introduction. Before I speak, I have a few words to say. So we wanted to cover the basics of Jewish belief, to cover the chain of Jewish tradition, and to cover where we are now with regards to the Jewish landscape, the Jews who live in the world today. And that we're going to have to understand the different movements that are in Judaism. By movements, it's like denominations, it's styles of Jews. And to really understand what I'll be teaching you as a conservative rabbi, you need to understand of Jewish opinions. So let's get started. In the beginning, Jews have never been monolithic. That is to say, going all the way back to the very beginning, there was a variety of Jews. You had bad types of diversity. You had idol worshippers. They were Jews, but they also worshipped idols. You had the people who rebelled against Moses. They were Jews, but they weren't following his leadership. You had the Sadducees. This was a group of Jews during the Second Temple period that believed in a very literal translation and an interpretation of Torah, and who had some difficulties. Question?
Yeah, do you have something like that?
No handout for today, but is that, you need it bigger? I can make a copy later. You had the Sikari. The Sikari were zealots. They were violent, basically terrorists. Again, back in the First Temple or Second Temple period. Wanda, do you have a question? Yes, I'll make a link to the document online, so you don't have to write everything down super fast. Right. Right now, understand. You can get a copy to the presentation. The Essenes were another Second Temple period group. If you've ever read the works of Josephus, he talks about the Essenes. This was the group that lived out by the Dead Sea. Perhaps the group that wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls. A very extreme view of purity laws and how to live. And so they lived a very different form of Judaism and a very antagonistic form of Judaism. And then the Karaites, just for good measure, the Karaites came in the 6th, 7th, 8th, 9th century. There are still some Karaites around. These were people who rejected the rabbinic interpretation. If you remember from our chart from our last meeting, when you get to the oral law, the Mishnah and the Talmud, the Karaites said, we don't buy it, right? We don't believe that. We think only the Tanakh, only the Bible is good enough. So groups that splintered, that broke apart in Judaism and caused a lot of Trouble.
My wife tells me that your podcast is on pause.
Hold on a second. It's on pause?
It looks like it's on pause.
Because I'm stuck on a slide. Ask her if she can hear me. Can you hear me now? Yeah, I know. It's infinity there. That's beautiful. Says it's broadcasting. Let's. All right. Well, let's let's pretend that it's working.
No, it's just sitting there.
Huh. Let me do a quick check of the settings. Webcam, there's only one. Default, there's only one, right? That should be working if it's going to work. How odd. Let's open that back up, and we'll go back to this, and I will just go. Oh, was that last week's or last time's? All right, so let's. What's the word on technology here? Are we working or are we not working? I guess I can always edit this out later.
Yeah, we can hear you, Rabbi.
What? You can hear me now?
We can hear what you say, but it's
Okay. But you mean the screen hasn't changed? Okay, but that's the right screen. Okay, we're good. Yay, technology. Hopefully the final recording online will be good. All right, you know, Moses had it easy. He didn't have to worry about computers. He had a few other problems. Oh, sorry, we didn't finish that page. And then there were what I would call neutral types of diversity. And these have always been there in Judaism too. So there is diversity in Judaism that doesn't cause problems. For example, we know that there were 12 tribes. When Joshua first led the Israelites into the land of Israel, the tribes lived in different regions, and each of them had their own local customs. Each of them had their own local style. They all followed the Torah in general, but the local variety was there, and that was a diversity. There's always been diversity between the people who lived in the cities and people who lived out in the farms, just a different style of living. There's, of course, the diversity of the Kohanim, the priests, and the rest of us who are not priests, and they have certain laws and we don't have them, and certain requirements and certain things. Then there is the differences that you might have also heard of, the Ashkenazim and the Sephardim, the Mizrahim, the Timanim, the Yemenite Jews, the Jews from Ethiopia. There are Jews who come from different cultural groups. We follow the same Judaism, but our cultural differences can make us very distinct, even while we share that core. That, no problem. That has been no problem. So we also recognize that diversity used to exist inside of every community before the Enlightenment. So let me first of all mention what the Enlightenment is. The Enlightenment. This is the term used in European philosophy, European thought, that beginning in around the 1700s, a little bit before, and definitely after, to have new ideas. People began to have a new willingness to ask questions and to investigate, looking for answers. This was the birth of modern science. This was the birth of modern politics, where people said, we don't need kings, we can have democracy. This was a complete change of society. But one of the changes that happened during this time in society was the change of asking questions about religion. And that's what we're going to be dealing with when we talk about the movements. But before this happened, before the Enlightenment came, every community, all across the world, every Jewish community had young people and it had old people. It had learned people, it had unlearned people. It had rich people, it had poor people. There were people who were very strict. And there were people who were very lenient in their interpretation. There were people who were very pious and devout, who were very impudent, who did not respect Torah, did not respect God. There were people that were lawful, and there were people that were criminals. And there were people that were traditionalists, who wanted to always keep things exactly the same way they had always been, were more creative and were trying new things and experimenting with new ideas. Before the Enlightenment came along, if you went to any Jewish community, you would find all of these people in the same community, because it was just like a regular town or a society or a neighborhood. You didn't have only one type of people, you had a full mixture of people. One of the reasons for that mixture was because Jews had to live together. Jews were forced by the governments of Europe and in many other places as well to live within their communities. In Europe, there were places called ghettos. These were walled areas that the Jews had to live inside. There were places in Poland or in Russia where Jews were by law required to live. And that meant if you were Jewish, you were going to be living in this area, mixed up with all the other people who were Jewish and who lived in the area. That created a very dynamic community. Lots of arguments, lots of energy, lots of frustration sometimes, but it made for a very real, full life community. After the Enlightenment, there's a change. When the Enlightenment comes along, Europe changes its relationship. Europe says, you're free. This is called the emancipation. There was an emancipation for the slaves of America. You may have heard about that, the Emancipation Proclamation. Well, there was the emancipation for Jews. It didn't happen quite the same way. Obviously, we weren't slaves in Europe. But what it did give us was more political freedom, more rights, more ability to choose our own destiny within the countries we lived in. It wasn't perfect. It wasn't like someone flicked the light switch and all of a sudden everybody loved the Jews. But it did give us more options and more choices. And when that happened, Jews began to make choices. And it is one of the truths of life that if you take a group of people, just say 100 people, and you put them on a bus and say, we're all going to go out to dinner, and the bus driver is going to take you to where we're having dinner, that everybody's going to eat at the same restaurant. But if you put everybody into their own cars and say, let's go have dinner, in a half an hour, everybody's going to be at a different restaurant. That when everybody has their own choice, they're going to go to what they like best, what works best for them. The community will diversify and stratify. It will turn into different groups of people who agree here and of people who agree there. And that's what happened with the Enlightenment. When Europe said the Jews were now free to connect, now had a new option. But that emancipation, that Enlightenment, it wasn't a perfect gift. There were strings attached. When the Europeans came to the Jewish people in the 1800s and said, you're free, they said, you're free if you give up your hope for a return to Israel. That means the land of Israel. If you give up your hope for a Messiah, if you give up your unique and different laws, and you give up your sense of peoplehood. And there's a quote here from Johann David Michaels from 1782, which he said, one must mention something which casts doubt on the full and steadfast loyalty of Jews to the state and the possibility of their full integration, namely their messianic expectation of a return to Palestine. Palestine was the default name for the land of Israel. They will always see the state as a temporary home, which they will leave in the hour of their greatest happiness to return to Palestine. For similar reasons, their forefathers were suspect in the eyes of the Egyptians. So what is Mr. Johann saying to us here? He's saying, I don't trust the Jews. I don't trust them because they don't want to live in Germany, in Holland, in Poland, in Russia. They want to live in Israel. They dream of Israel. And as long as they dream of Israel, they can't be good Frenchmen. They can't be good Germans. They can't be good Danish people. because they're always looking for somewhere else. And therefore, the offer of freedom really came with the idea that we should reject our hope and our dream of having Israel, of having the Messiah come, of having ourselves considered still as a people. So that was the choice that we were given. You can be free, but you have to give this up. And some people said, okay. And around the year 1810 was the birth of what we now call the Reform movement, Reform Judaism. These were the Jews who began mostly in Germany, but it's a good deal. That is fair, because Judaism has been so stale for so long that we need to change things anyway. And if we have to give up a dream of going to Israel, well, let's be honest. Do we really want to leave Germany? No, we love Germany. We like German food. We like the German language. We like German culture. We want to be here in Germany. What we need to do is update Judaism. We're not getting rid of it. We're just going to update it, and we'll make it fit with German life better. And that means the German people will love us more, and we can be happy and still be Jewish here. We just need to adjust things. As the Constitution of the Hamburg Temple, which was the first Reform synagogue, wrote, they plan to arrange in the city also, for themselves as well as others who think as they do, a dignified and well-ordered ritual, which was not the normal way of Jewish prayer at that time, Jewish prayer being more spontaneous and individual, but they wanted to make it more German, which was ordered and dignity. They'll have this worship service, and it shall be conducted. Specifically, there will be introduced at such services a German sermon, choral singing, meaning having a choir, and the accompaniment of an organ. These were all things that were totally new. Before the Reform movement, the rabbi didn't give a sermon every week. When the rabbi did give a sermon in the synagogue, he didn't give the sermon in German. In Germany, he would give the sermon in Yiddish. That was because that was the Jewish language. German wasn't the Jewish language. But in the Reform movement, they decided they needed to update. The same thing with having a choir sing. You don't need a choir to sing in a traditional Jewish service, because everybody is singing their own prayers and then occasionally singing together and then doing their own prayers. Why would you need a choir? And an organ? The organ is even more controversial, because there were many opinions that said the playing of an instrument on Shabbat was forbidden. So the Reform movement began with these types of changes when they began their congregations. Now, I'm going to point out later on, the Reform movement of 1810 is very different than the Reform movement of 2017. The movement of 2017 is more traditional than the Reform movement of 1810. They have sort of come back in much of their practice from how far this got back in the 1800s. So there were some changes. All right, so that was the Reform movement start. Everyone with me so far? After the Reform movement came Orthodox Judaism. Now I know that may sound a little weird, because many people think that Orthodox Judaism existed before Reform Judaism. Case, if you remember, we'll just do what I want, yes. If you remember, before the Enlightenment, that's what your community looked like. It was a full mixture, and there were people in there who were strict and people in there who were lenient and all of everything in between. What the Orthodox came to see was that what the Reform was doing was too extreme. This was crazy. You can't change Judaism so much, and you shouldn't change Judaism for those reasons. And so a group of Jews, again, starting mostly in Germany, but then getting more strength in countries like Hungary, Romania, and Poland, they decided that they would push back against the Reform movement. They didn't just stop what Reform was trying to change. They wanted to make things that were stricter than they had been before the Reform movement began. Because anybody who's ever worked with, say, a child, knows that when the child has done something wrong, if you want to teach them, You don't just keep saying don't, don't, don't. You have to make the rule stricter so that the child will learn what they need to do. And that was the philosophy of the Orthodox movement that began in response to the Reform movement. And they even had the motto that innovation is prohibited by the Torah, right? That anything new is forbidden from the Torah. And here's a few examples of some of their statements. This was in response, got a little bit cut off, but we'll make do. So they said in response to the building of the Reform congregation, that instead it is forbidden to change the worship that is customary in Israel, that means the Jewish people, from Birchot HaShachar, the earliest part of our service, all the way to Aleinu, which is at the very end of the service. And all the more so to make any deletions in the traditional liturgy. All right, now that statement was not true before they said it. That is to say, anybody who has studied the history of Jewish prayer knows that Jewish prayer has changed in all of that section over the last 2,000 years. We have very good documents that show when things were added and words were changed in order to make the prayers continue to be meaningful and spiritual. But they saw the threat of reform and said, even though it usually would be permitted to make some changes, we are going to say you can make no changes. And that there's an irony that they were making a change by prohibiting change, but they thought this was the best way to defend Judaism against the reform changes. It is forbidden to pray in any language other than the Holy Tongue, meaning Hebrew, and every prayer book that is printed improperly and not in accordance with our practice is invalid, and it is forbidden to pray from it. The Talmud itself discusses that you can pray in any language. You can pray in any language that is meaningful. After all, God knows every language. It's not as though he's going to be confused by your prayer in German, English, French, or whatever. To protect Hebrew as the language of their prayer, they felt that they needed to prohibit people from praying in other languages. Same thing in part 3, prohibited to play musical instruments. This was, again, more of a reinforcement. This was a more controversial issue because it had always been prohibited since the destruction of the Second Temple, and also because of the understanding of Shabbat laws. Okay, so Orthodox Judaism, get started. Good? Clear? Questions? All right, we're rolling along. Conservative Judaism. Hello, I'm a conservative rabbi. 1886 approximately is the beginning of the conservative movement. This was the founding of the Jewish Theological Seminary of America, which is which was the main school for training conservative rabbis up until we opened up schools in Buenos Aires and opened up schools in Los Angeles and Israel and just the new one in Berlin. So if you notice, 1886, that's much, much later. Right? We had 1810 for the Reform movement, and we had about 1820 for the Orthodox movement, and now 60 years later, we're getting the conservative movement. So what happened in the meantime? Well, what happened in the meantime is that the Reform movement ran one direction and began making huge changes. They went much farther than just German sermons, singing with a choir, and having an organ. Some of the Reform congregations began to put their Shabbat on Sunday. And of course, many of the Reform congregations began saying, not only do we not hope for the Messiah or hope to return, we're no longer going to do circumcision. We're no longer going to keep kosher. We're going to change all of these other aspects of Jewish law. And the Orthodox said, not only do we reject the changes of the Reform, but we are going to make our faith stricter and more stringent and keep people from making any new ideas because we're afraid that they might lead to those bad ideas. And you could imagine that as both groups moved, the group in the middle who went, we disagree, right? That's not right. We don't think we should be eating pork. We don't think we should be eating clams and oysters and breaking Shabbat and all of this. But we also don't think having a German sermon is a terrible idea. You know, if you can teach in German, you can teach in Hebrew. That's a nice thing. That maybe having some new melodies for prayers is a good thing. Maybe, you know, allowing the study of history and secular studies is helpful. And that the modern world, even though it has some scary parts to it, and even though the culture can be very dangerous and tempting, also has some good ideas. And we need to examine those ideas and see if they fit or if they don't fit with Judaism. So Zecharia Frankel wrote the following, and it's a little long, but he's doing kind of a summary, so bear with me. Maintaining the integrity of Judaism simultaneously with progress. This is the essential problem of the present. Right? Progress was speeding up, Judaism was falling apart. How do we keep everything together? And how do we keep up with the world? Where is the point where the two apparent contraries meet? How do we allow both progress and Judaism to be together? The viewpoint of the Orthodox, he said, is clear. In the meticulous observance of the precepts, can it find that complete satisfaction? He was talking about the Reform. Sees salvation in overcoming the past, in carrying progress to the limit, in rejecting religious forms and returning merely to the simple original idea. Right? It's don't worry about the law, worry only about the spirit. Is of the Reform movement. Hebrews don't work. We will now turn to a third party, which has arisen from the first, and recognizes that the task of Judaism is religious action, but demands that this action shall not be empty of spirit, and that it shall not become, he's saying you don't only just do the commandments because they're the commandments, but you also don't throw away the commandments. You need to have them done with the spirit. And furthermore, it holds that we must omit certain unimportant actions that are not inherently connected either with the high ideas or with the religious forms delineated by revealed laws. So this is saying we keep Torah and we keep Rabbinic Judaism intact, but some of the culture and customs that had become common practice, but not Jewish law, those we can change as we enjoy the progress of the modern world. So just because my great-great-great-great-grandfather only had a horse and buggy, he can't have a car. And just because he only married somebody that his father told him to marry, doesn't mean I can't choose my wife. There's nothing in Jewish law that says you have to only be married by matchmaking. That was common by culture, but it wasn't part of Jewish law. And so the conservative movement began with the idea that the essential core of Judaism that had to be preserved, had to be saved, had to be protected, but there were also certain elements of the culture that could be changed, and by changing them, make the core even stronger. As he says, this third party declares that Judaism must be saved for all time. It affirms, it believes that both the divine value and historical basis of Judaism, that by introducing some changes, it may achieve some agreement with the concepts and conditions of the time. Judaism has always been flexible, has always had to adapt without betraying itself. If a person moves to a new town, they don't immediately do everything that everyone else does, because those people might not be good people, but they probably do get used to living in that new area to some degree. I know before I came to Florida, I didn't know how to live when it was hot and humid. I grew up in San Diego. It was not something I was used to. Here in Florida, I've had to get used to it. Now, that doesn't mean I walk around wearing a bathing suit all the time, but it does mean I don't wear a tie as often as I used to. Does that mean I have given up who I was? No, because who I was wasn't the tie. The tie was just part of the culture of when I had been raised. And that was the idea of the conservative movement. Okay, questions? We sort of have the original spirit for all these movements pretty clear? Okay, what do they believe on different topics? So this is where we get to what are the differences? Philosophy, those are the ideas, but what does this mean? Well, revelation. Revelation means, where did the Torah come from? Where did Judaism come from? In the Reform movement, they believe that the Torah is a record of the Jewish people's relationship with God. All right, notice that the Jewish people experienced God, and then they wrote down what they experienced. It has changed, therefore, over time, because the relationship has continued to change. And not all of its words should therefore be seen as eternally true. Some were only true for other generations, and some were human interpretations, and thus limited. So this is one of the fundamental reasons why in the Reform movement, they can say, we don't need to keep kosher, because keeping kosher was just for the past. But now we can connect to God without keeping kosher, so we don't need to worry about it. That is a Reform belief based on how they view Revelation. The conservative movement, there's a lot more variety than just this, but this is sort of the most common explanation in the conservative movement. The Torah that we have is the Torah God wants us to have. Right? It's not our record. This is God's gift. Every word, therefore, is divinely true and eternal. Right? We don't get to edit anything. We don't get to cut anything from the Torah. But we do admit that our ability to understand the Torah is still growing. But nevertheless, nothing can be ignored or erased. So sometimes we will need to read the Torah and we will understand it a little differently than our ancestors did, but the Torah is still the Torah, and we're not deleting anything from it. The Orthodox are similar, except for really that last part, right? The Torah, they believe, was given in a literal series of dictations, right? Just like right now, I'm talking, you're writing, that it was exactly like that. Moses sat down with a big scroll and a big pen and a lot of ink and just wrote what God said. There are other feelings within Jewish tradition, however, that explain that differently. But in Orthodoxy, this has become the main expression. And they believe, therefore, as well, that the interpretation of the Torah is fixed and unchanging all time. All right? We're not going to re-examine, we're not going to re-understand something. We know it, it's done.
It doesn't matter the reforms or conservative or orthodox. It was one Torah for everyone. For everyone.
Well, for everyone, yeah, we use the same Torah, right? If you go into a Reform congregation and you take their Torah, and you go to a conservative and you take their Torah, and you go to an Orthodox and take their Torah, and you open all three of them up to the same place. But if you ask them, what does this mean? Or if you ask them, do I have to do this? You will get different answers in the different communities. Okay, Israel, meaning the land of Israel and the state of Israel. The Reform movement, we have to make a difference between classical reform, meaning old reform, 1800s, early 1900s, and reform now, because they have changed more on this than anything else. Old reform, the land of Israel is a part of our history, but not our future. Remember, they gave up the dream of going back to Israel. They believe that we are citizens of other countries now, and no desire to return or rebuild. Israel, they believed, was no more sacred, special than any other place on earth. That was the belief of the reformers in Germany and Europe in the 1800s. I know, it's startling, but that was what they believed they needed to feel to become part of European society. And you can imagine someone back in that age, and that was what the Reform people were saying, you could imagine being, whoa, what are you talking about? How could you say Israel isn't holy and more holy than Berlin? But that was their times and what they believed. Now, the modern Reform movement these days, they absolutely believe that Israel is the homeland of our people and that we should support it. So there are Reform Jews who live in Israel. There are many Reform Jews in America that support Israel. They have changed 180 degrees on this topic, and thank goodness. The conservative movement, we long for the liberation of Israel. Remember, the conservative movement began before Israel was free. We long for its liberation, and we support all those who want to rebuild it. And we believe that one day it will be the center of a global redemption. We will never turn our back on Israel. For all of its history, the conservative movement has been the most consistent supporter of Israel. From the beginning of our movement until today, we have always believed in the state of Israel, the people who are rebuilding Israel, and helping that to become the beautiful country that it is. For Orthodox, it's complicated. And that's the most polite way to put it. Right? In the old days, before Israel became a state, when Jews were trying to move to Israel, the Orthodox rabbis of Europe said, don't go. Forbidden to go to the land of Israel and rebuild. Because they said, God will take us to the land of Israel to rebuild, and you have to wait for the Messiah before we go. And that meant that, unfortunately, many, many thousands of Orthodox people were unable to escape Europe before the attacks of the early 20th and then of World War II, because they did not want to leave where they lived, and they didn't believe going to Israel was a good option. Now, after Israel has become an independent state, it's still complicated. Most Orthodox do not officially believe that the state of Israel, meaning the government of Israel, because it's a democracy. It's not ruled by the king that comes from David. It's not ruled by the Messiah. It's not ruled by Jewish law. And therefore, it's kind of illegitimate. They will mostly support it in the meantime, because they believe that by working with the government, they can make Israel be more Orthodox. So there is some support, although there are some Orthodox groups that completely reject Israel even to this day, and say that Israel should not be there, that you should not go to Israel, and you should not help Israel. But they're a minority, now compromised with their feelings about Israel. Questions, comments, onward. Okay, come on. The Messiah, Mashiach, the anointed one, the Redeemer. Also going to see some differences. So the Reform movement has changed a little bit on this, but it's still the basic idea has been the same, which is that we no longer wait for a person to redeem the world. God has already taught us what we need, and the visions of the prophet are about a messianic age, a time period, not a person, when the Spirit of God will unite the world and there's not going to be any person leading that time. So that is the sort of most common interpretation in the Reform movement about the concept of the Messiah. That yes, eventually the world will be perfected, a particular leader, it'll just happen naturally as the world comes closer to God. The conservative movement, again, there's more than just one opinion, but this is sort of the average opinion in the movement. We look for the Messiah who will inspire us and the world to draw close to God and thus end human suffering. But it's a pretty big idea. So we do believe there will be a person. We don't know exactly what that will be like. We don't have a picture that we can tell you this is it. But we do believe this will happen. And the important thing is that we believe that person will teach, that person will lead, that person will inspire the world to draw close. Most do still in the conservative also have the connection with that person and the house of David, but the Orthodox emphasize that even more. That this will be a king that comes from the house of David that will bring the redemption of the people through leadership and teaching. And really, between the conservative and Orthodox, there's a lot of overlap on that picture of redemption. How are we doing? Have to catch up. Is that Jesus? So the Christians believe that Jesus already came, Messiah, but Judaism says if the job's not done, then that wasn't the Messiah. And there are other people besides Jesus that have come around throughout the centuries that we have said, this person is helping, but now they're dead. They're not the Messiah. There have been other false starts, if you will. We will talk in a later class in much more detail about what Judaism believes about the end of days. The time, B'olam haba, the world to come, and Bayom Hahu, the day when the world will change and finally reach this point. But that'll be in much more detail in another class. This is just sort of the surface level.
We look for the Messiah, who will inspire
Mm-hmm.
and the world
Yes.
to grow close to God and to suffering. Who was Messiah death?
Who? I don't know yet. A person, a human being. Yes.
We are still waiting.
We are still waiting.
Oh.
We are still waiting. And it could be tomorrow. It could be 1,000 years from now. Change. If you may remember when we started, change was a big topic. And this is one of the places where you can feel the difference between the different movements very strongly. In the Reform movement, the way Judaism has been practiced became stale and mechanical. Change helps revive the spirit and move us closer to God. Change, therefore, is a good thing. Right? The Reform movement basically believes that change is always a positive value, that change allows us to continue to improve and continue to reform what we are doing in a way that gets better and better and better. So within the Reform movement, change is a positive idea, a positive virtue. The conservative movement, change is not good or bad by itself. By itself isn't good and it isn't bad. Judaism has always adapted to new cultures and situations, but change itself isn't a goal to be pursued. Right? We don't change because we like change. We change because change is the best solution, the best answer, the best choice for our current situation. Change isn't something to be avoided either. We don't refuse to change just because it's change. We only refuse to change because sometimes not changing is the right answer, the right solution, the right choice for that situation. And that choice of whether it is good to, whether you should change or not change, that needs to be an organic and well-studied process. It shouldn't be done overnight. And the next slide, we're going to talk about who makes those choices. But that is the basic conservative principle. So even though we call ourselves conservative Judaism, it doesn't mean we always conserve. We're not always refusing to change. And even though we call ourselves progressive, that doesn't mean we rush to change. We instead choose. Sometimes it's the right thing to do. Sometimes it's the wrong thing to do. And you know what? That's hard, to be perfectly honest. Knowing when it's right to change and when it's right to stay, that is a very difficult choice to make. The Reform movement have a little bit easier, and the Orthodox have it a little bit easier, right? For Orthodoxy, the way Judaism has been practiced must be protected at all costs. It means being stricter than our ancestors. Protective change, they believe, is okay, but other types of change is wrong. And they do this very consciously, they're very aware of this, that they know they are making changes by being stricter, but they believe that is the only thing that will save Judaism right now. They believe the dangers of the modern world are so bad that you have to make extra protection because of those dangers. Protections is don't change unless you're only getting stricter. If I give you a quick example, just the laws of keeping kosher, because it's very easy to see the progress in that. The way that people keep kosher today, the way people kept kosher when I was a little boy. And the way people kept kosher when I was a little boy is much stricter than the way people kept kosher 200 years ago and 500 years ago. But past 200 years ago, it wasn't changing so much. It was pretty stable. But when Orthodoxy came in, they began to increase the stringency. You'll see many people nowadays with 2 sinks, some people who have 2 refrigerators or 3 stoves. It gets more and more and more and more. And that, they believe, will protect Judaism. Question? Or are you just agreeing? Just agreeing, okay. All right, which brings us to authority. Who decides, right? Who makes these choices of change or not change? Who decides what the Messiah is or isn't in our movement? And again, each of the movements has a different feeling about who makes these decisions. In the Reform movement, with the spirit of the Enlightenment, the spirit of democracy, the spirit of the New World, they said, me, the individual, and you, and you, and you, and you, and you are all really responsible for your choices. That's it. If you decide that keeping kosher is spiritually important to you, you keep kosher. And if you decide it isn't, you don't have to. No one else can tell you that you need to or not. They do believe, of course, things like murder or theft. Those you don't get to choose for yourself. Of the, well, it's a difficult text, but a difficult way of putting it, but they describe it for much of the ritual, the holidays and all the other forms of Jewish expression. Those the individual gets to choose. The community of the rabbi, we can instruct, we can give information, but ultimately no one can decide except the individual. The conservative movement, we like to believe, and I think quite accurately, that we are keeping to the way that Judaism made choices for 2,000 years, which is, if somebody is trained in Jewish law, rabbi, if somebody is trained in Jewish law, has been appointed because they have been trained, then they can make decisions that are rules for their community. Right? So if I make a decision, and again, keeping kosher is just an easy example, if I make a decision of what kind of dishes we're going to use in our synagogue, that's the rule for this synagogue. And if a rabbi in another synagogue makes a slightly different decision, that's the rule for that synagogue. And local rabbis are the people who make those decisions, because it is the local rabbi who is interacting with their community, who knows that community best, and who knows the needs of that community best. However, let me just finish the column and then we'll take questions. However, individuals don't call the rabbi up to ask questions constantly about everything. The individuals are supposed to study and learn and know how to make most basic decisions for themselves. Right? I don't want you calling me when you're in the supermarket every time. I want you to know what you can buy and what you can't buy. And if there's a tricky question, something new that you've never heard of before, or something you've never seen before, the text, the call, the email, that's when you say, Rabbi, take a picture with your phone. Rabbi, what's this? Is this okay? But the basic questions you should all be able to handle on your own. And then that last sentence is very important. Communities, however, choose their own rabbi. So let's imagine, for example, that as a rabbi, I said, you know what? I think we're going to have whale meat for our next big event. And everybody in the congregation went, but Rabbi, whale? I said, oh no, whale is great. It's perfectly fine. It's kosher. Technically, that rule is for our community, but guess what the community does? The community gets rid of the rabbi. Right? If the rabbi makes decisions that the communities absolutely reject, then the rabbi gets kicked out of the community. And that has been the, I like to call this a soft form of being a dictator. Right? Because technically the rabbi makes the rule, but the rabbi has to know the community well enough, because the community can always replace the rabbi if they don't like the rules that are being made. It's the rabbi's job to guide the community to understand why these decisions are being made in the face of opposition and disagreement. And it's the community's responsibility to try and learn and understand, and not to reject the rabbi just because they don't like the answer. This is a partnership, but yes, the rabbi is in a position of authority when it comes to making decisions on Jewish law. Very important little footnote. Rabbis, however, do not make decisions about what color the tablecloth is. Right? The rabbi's authority is not about what do we paint the walls, how do we do the flooring. Rabbis only make decisions for the community's Jewish needs, not just some of the other things that happen. All right, you had a question. Right. Okay, exactly right. So let me make sure everyone heard the question, because the room has a bit of an echo, right? So if I am a conservative Jew, but I have feet, and I can go from one synagogue to another to find the rabbi or decision that I like, then doesn't that mean I'm like in the reform column? I'm making that decision. Kind of. And that has been true for Judaism always, right? When Moses gave a law and said, this is the mitzvah, people still had the choice of whether or not they were going to follow it. Right? Moses said, don't worship idols. And a whole bunch of people worshiped an idol. Right? Because ultimately, yes, each individual is responsible for choosing to follow the commandments or not. However, is that in the Reform philosophy, the individual chooses whether it's right or wrong. In the conservative, they choose whether they agree or disagree. But they can't change that it's right or wrong. So if I say this is right, and someone says, well, I don't agree, it doesn't change that it's still, this is the right way. The main difference. But you're right, there is a soft level of cooperation between the rabbi as the authority and the community, where if the rabbi is way over here and the community is way over here, they're not going to work together. Thankfully, people who choose to be part of conservative congregations, they tend to have very similar feelings, opinions, and decisions. It's okay, I can be a rabbi for them. But if and this goes way back to our beginning, where in the old days when people used to be all mixed together and not spread out in different communities, it was much harder to be a rabbi for that big community of all sorts of different opinions. Now, it's a little bit easier, because the people who belong to a conservative synagogue are going to be of a very similar type to one another. Did you have a question?
That's not a question. I'm just learning.
Oh, that's why we're doing the class.
Exactly. And, from what I'm gathering, the Torah is the word of God. Okay? So you got three different groups. Who gives them the authority to change what God is needing?
Well,
you know what I'm saying?
I know exactly what you're saying. And in fact, that basic question, which is like the level below all of this, you're getting very deep here, goes down into the question of how do we relate to the Torah at all? And the fact is that in Judaism, we believe, and modern scholarship has finally caught up with this idea, that when you read a text, when you understand the law, you have to interpret it. It's impossible to read something without putting some interpretation into it. Right? We're not a computer that you can just put the machine in, add the information in, and the answer comes out. That is why the Torah itself in Deuteronomy says that when you need decisions, you go to the judges, the leaders of your generation. You need to have that explained to you. And so Judaism has always believed explanation. That if two people open up the Torah and just start reading, they will have two different opinions. And then, well, in my opinion, you end up with a very broken society. That level of knowing that we need some shared understanding if we're going to have any community, That goes all the way back into Deuteronomy, with the idea that we need to have explanation, we need to have teaching, we need interpretation. Who gets to choose who gets to do that job of interpretation? That comes back to the idea of the rabbinic chain of teaching. So I was taught by my rabbis, they were taught by their rabbis, and their rabbis, and their rabbis, and their rabbis, going back for a couple of thousand years. And it's that chain that allows each generation the authority for their generation and to choose who will have that authority in the next generation. And it is supposed to be by merit. It is supposed to be, you know, who is the best for making those decisions, because it's not an easy job. And it's not a job that, you know, it's a job you have to be uniquely suited for. And it's not that you have to be smarter than other people or more pious than other people. It has a lot to understand all the pieces and see the big picture, which is very tricky.
You're giving me an analogy of one of the other classes, it's like length. You can only go so far with that length before it stops.
As a conservative Jew, that's exactly what I believe, right? There's only so far you can go in the interpretation before the interpretation stretches the words and you can break. But that authority and that ability in the conservative movement, and we believe throughout Jewish history, has always been focused on the local rabbi. The Orthodox, on the other hand, they believe that the Gedolei Hador, the greats of each generation, they are the only ones who can truly make real decisions, who have real authority. They can answer questions. You know, someone asks you a simple question about Shabbat, a simple question about business. The rabbi can quote the answers of Jewish law. But to make an interpretation, to make an application, especially for something new, only a very, very few, like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 people in the world get to make those decisions. And then those decisions are shared by the people underneath them. And that way in Orthodoxy, you don't have local rabbis who are making decisions that are like, it's okay to do German. It's important to remember that the Reform movement, when it began with traditionally trained rabbis leading it. The rabbis in Germany who began the Reform movement, they agreed with everything that we've said here. And they believed that was the right answer for Judaism in that generation. And that gave them, in a sense, the authority to make the changes for their community. Obviously, I disagree with their decisions because I'm a conservative rabbi, and you should all know that and make sure that you're okay with that. But that was how we ended up spread into the different movements. So there are other movements now as well that have come up even more recently, but I didn't have time to put them in for tonight. So we'll talk about the Reconstructionist and Renewal and Humanist and Secularist and all these other groups some other time. But that's the basic. And I saw a hand for another question.
Just going back to what you said the last time we did about God. So it just seems like each one of these has a different guidance.
Mm-hmm.
So, but in each one of these, the person is expected to arrive at some deep understanding, not necessarily dependent on someone else's interpretation all the time.
Yes, right. You are supposed to be an independent actor. Right? You're not supposed to be a puppet of Judaism. You are supposed to understand it, and all three of the movements, and I'm glad you put it that way, believe that the individual needs to choose to live with meaning and with purpose according to Torah. They just have a very different idea of what that looks like and of how you get to that point. But the ultimate goal, they do agree, which is why, and this is a very important point, and thank you for getting me onto it, because I almost forgot to mention it. Even though I am a conservative rabbi, I respect Reform Jews and I respect Orthodox Jews. And I am not so arrogant to believe that my way is the only true way for the entirety of all the Jewish people. It could be in 150 years, in 200 years, in 1,000 years, it could be that Reform Judaism really had the right answer. Or it could be that Orthodoxy really had the right answer. Or it could be the conservatives really had the right answer. Or it could be that all three of us had part of the answer, and there's something that's coming just after us that will somehow blend it in a different way. I don't know yet. I know that my teachers and the Judaism that I have learned and the Torah that I teach, I believe is very powerful, makes a great deal of sense, and is a true expression of what we were given by God, and still has meaning and power for another 1,000 years. But I respect those who disagree with me, and I am willing to absolutely share this wonderful world with people who have those other opinions. Yes?
So do we have, as of today, something kind of like a Sanhedrin, like where Reform, Conservative, and Orthodox get together and discuss, like,
No.
we are the greatest of our generation,
Right.
gather here.
Wonderful idea, great vision, not happening. Right, so the idea was, do we have like a court that could bring everybody together and discuss things and have these shared ideas? Not yet. You know, are we working on it? Kind of. Right, so the conservative movement and the reform movement, we meet all the time. We share ideas, and we try to find things that we can do together. You may or may not know, our religious school here, we partner with a Reform congregation. So we have the children of a Reform congregation and children of a conservative congregation going to school together. And their clergy and me, we sit down and we do the curriculum together, and we make sure that the children are learning things that we want them to learn. There's a few things extra we do for the conservative kids, but mostly it's pretty much the same. For our services, most of the time we're going to be doing things differently. You know, high holidays, Rosh Hashanah coming up, they're going to be in one place and we're going to be here. So there's a lot that we can do together, but there's also some things that we just disagree on and that we keep separate so that they can have their way and we can have ours. And for now, that's been an okay solution. Question over there.
If the conservative movement is recognized in Israel, if the conservative movement is recognized by the Orthodox in Israel?
No. The conservative movement is not recognized by the Orthodox anywhere. Not recognized in Israel or in the United States or any country. The Orthodox, 1800s, they believe they need to protect Judaism from the Reform movement and from us because they think that we are breaking Judaism. So they believe that we're Jews, those that were born Jewish, but they don't believe the Judaism we do is right. They believe that we are committing sins by doing the Judaism the way we do. And for those of you that are thinking of converting, the Orthodox do not believe that our conversions, even though we follow Jewish law, our conversions are real conversions. And in the state of Israel, that becomes more complicated because to be seen as a Jew in the state of Israel, if you are converting, you need to have Orthodox approval. However, to move to Israel, to make Aliyah, to be a citizen of Israel, you need an Orthodox conversion. So you can go to Israel, but they won't call you Jewish. And that is a very painful place to be in. And it's political, really, more than religious. But we'll talk more about how conversion works and the state of Israel and all of those things in other classes. All right, that's all for tonight. Thank you very much. I'll see you next Thursday at 6 o'clock, and we'll be getting into the meat of Jewish practice and life. And I hope this recorded.